Prime Minister Harper led in February the largest ever trade mission in Canada's history to China. How does this square with Canada's robust stance on human rights and the rule of law?
The good news is that there is consistency and that modern states have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So at just about every private meeting, and I've talked to people who are part of the delegation, our Prime Minister raised the issue of human rights, whether it was about investment, whether it was meeting with senior leaders of the Chinese administration, plus he made a public speech or two in China about why we have to see democracy and human rights make progress, and that they should understand that part of the trading relationship with Canada, where there's benefits for us and benefits for them, is understanding that we will not back away from the human rights and democracy pillar of what we think is valuable for people everywhere. Having said all that, we have to respect who the Chinese are. They have their own history, their own background. They have their own internal pressures that they have to manage in constructive ways. But Canada believes that engagement is how, in fact, you can build a better rapport around how progress can be made. And the Chinese, I think, have come to accept that part of the relationship with Canada will not be a sort of sotto voce whispering about human rights, but that Canadian leaders will be clear and precise. And the more we work together, the more opportunity there is, I think, to produce real progress over a reasonable period of time. And that's what Canada's intent genuinely is.
To what extent has that been driven by increasing disagreements with Canada's closest ally, of course, the United States?
The United States has always been our most senior and most substantial trading partner. It will always be number one. The issue is China is now number two, and how big will number two become? And in how many different dynamics will that become apparent? We have had issues with pipelines into the United States. We have had opposition to Canadian pipelines producing a safe and democratic source of energy for our American allies, but they're still our primary allies. And the great thing about allies is that we may disagree on issues from time to time, but the core relationship with each other, the mutual dependency and the mutual trust, does not dissipate through the peace. We have billions of barrels of oil in our oil sands. We have remarkable amounts of gas, unparalleled in the world, some of the largest reserves anywhere. And it's important for the Canadian economy that we find constructive markets for both those resources. And the notion of finding a way to do it with appropriate environmental assessment via pipelines to the West Coast and shipping it not just to our Chinese trading partners, but to India and other countries in that part of the world makes eminent good sense. And the Prime Minister is doing what's right for Canada's economy in pursuing that.
Canada has outlined that it needs to be responsive to new threats as they emerge, and it needs to take a more robust role. Does this mean that since withdrawal from the combat mission in Afghanistan, Canada is now better placed to get involved in regional hotspots such as the Horn of Africa or countries in the Arab world?
The history of Canadian involvement in Afghanistan is actually very precise and, if I may say so, quite focused. When the initial engagement with the Taliban to move them out of government so that Afghanistan would not be a training ground for further attacks on our allies had to be addressed, Canada deployed a battle group with the Americans into Kandahar province for that purpose. When it was important to protect Kabul so that a new democracy and the Loya Jirgas that had to take place could take place in a secure context, Canada was responsible for the protection of Kabul. And then when the democratic government was established and there was a serious problem in Kandahar province that could threaten the survival of all of the newly democratic Afghanistan, Canada deployed to the most dangerous area of the country, namely Kandahar. The most serious strategic problem being faced now by our friends in Afghanistan is the training of their own capacity, their own police and their own military capacity. So it's completely logical that that's where Canada should be now focusing its activities. We have seen from this Prime Minister and this government a substantial increase in our defense spending. From a budget that used to mumble around the 12 billion number mark, we're now over 21 billion. And that is just an increase in over 4 or 5 years. That means we do have capacity today we did not have. But Canada's view of how to engage in our strategic values is as much humanitarian as it is geopolitical. We could not have deployed an entire Globemaster team of hundreds of people on the ground to deal with the Haitian earthquake before the new aircraft that were purchased by this administration. That was a huge humanitarian deployment involving the Royal Canadian Navy, the Air Force, and men and women on the ground giving medical aid and assistance. Our capacity to do that is now enhanced, and that means that Canada can be counted upon when the UN and other organizations call to engage fully. Libya was really a response to the responsibility to protect doctrine, which says when a country and a country's government is prepared to use its own artillery and its own air force against its own people in sorting out a domestic dispute, or is unable to engage to protect people from a genocidal threat, that's when the United Nations has said the world has to find a way to engage. And that's precisely what NATO did, and Canada was part of that exercise and delighted to do so. And I think the commitment from the Canadian government is that we cannot sit back and wait till the bodies are piled like cordwood before the world engages. We've been through that. We know what that looks like. We know how terrible that is. I remember visiting our troops in Bosnia-Herzegovina many years ago, and I met a European diplomat at a hotel who said, you know, you Canadians, you're great people, but you should leave these problems to European diplomacy. To which my response was, now which cycle did you want? Sarajevo 1 to Sarajevo 2, is that the cycle? Or how about the cycle of Auschwitz to Srebrenica? Is that a cycle where European diplomacy kind of establishes a better world? So sometimes Canada and other countries engage to keep things from getting worse. And it may not be pretty, but it is our core humanitarian responsibility to each other.
It seems that Canada has the wind in its sails in terms of pursuing a more assertive global role. Why is that?
I'd like to think that Canadians, because we are polite to a fault, how do you know it's a Canadian standing in front of a bank machine because he's the one saying please and thank you? You know, I mean, we are known for that kind of very careful. And that being said, Canada is a country that has clear and precise values: the rule of law, gender equality, tolerance for all faiths and religions, human rights, democracy. And I think you can expect that when those principles are under serious threat, Canada will first look for diplomatic solutions and multinational solutions. But when it becomes apparent that only a few countries may be prepared to engage, if asked to do so, Canada is likely to give that kind of request more serious consideration than was the case in the past. It is not that Canada has deserted peacekeeping. It's that the circumstances that made peacekeeping possible no longer exist. You can peacekeep when both sides want peace, and you need someone in the middle to actually certify that certain things are taking place, which is what Canada did so successfully in Suez many decades ago. But in circumstances where there are groups who do not want peace, who are prepared to keep on killing innocent civilians, you have to look at peacemaking. Well, peacemaking is another form of combat capacity, and that's what we have seen in a series of theaters really since the end of the Suez Proposition.
How does the Commonwealth fit in with this wider global remit that Canada has assumed in recent times?
What we see now in the world is that when things go badly, when there is no other option other than a military engagement, it's the UN Security Council, it's NATO, it's others who have to engage. But there are very few organizations that are able to do the work well in advance in a prophylactic way to keep bad things from happening. And the Commonwealth is one of those organizations, unique in its size and scope, investing in things like development and education and technical assistance and governance and democracy and trade, the sorts of things that keep military coups from happening because there's peaceful ways to sort out some of the problems that provide greater economic opportunity. The capacity, for example, of our Indian friends, which is a remarkable miracle, to have lifted millions out of poverty into a middle-class context. The job isn't done, and they'd be the first to admit it, speaks to how the principles of democracy, rule of law, and economic enterprise and hard work come together to make the life of millions of people way better. And the Commonwealth is a unique organization able to make that happen. If we engage fully, we can reduce the risks for the 54 countries and the 2.1 billion people in the Commonwealth that are sometimes produced when there really isn't a capacity to make economic or democratic progress.
Senator Segal, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure.